Thank you for allowing me to come here. It's a great pleasure to represent SFI. I'll talk about these new technologies because I think it's very important to note that it's not just AI. There are many new technologies that are changing our world at a rapid pace. So I'll try to give some examples and also sort of demonstrate what these technologies they do. So my plan is to give a big picture of what's going on. I'll give some technology examples, and then I'll talk about the impact, some of the really big impacts, and that creates challenges, but also great opportunities. So I'll give you some few examples of solutions. And then I'll end up with a discussion of what can the big data actually tell us about where we are going. And of course, we don't know where we're going, and the big data can't really predict, but it can maybe give us some hints. So the big data, or the big picture, is that our physical technologies, which are different from our social technologies, our new physical technologies, think about hammer and a nail, an app to a cell phone or something, that these new technologies, not the hammer and nail, but the new ones, which I'll come to in a second, they are rapidly moving away from our social technologies. Since, or through the industrial era, we have developed, governance principles that has been working. We have made national laws, we have made international laws, trade laws. We have defined markets. We have developed our religions, et cetera, et cetera. And in particular, we have developed narratives by which we can understand and navigate in the world as we live in. But these two things don't match anymore. The social technologies, they have to be updated so that they fit with the new physical reality. And just as importantly, we need to figure out how the heck we implement these new technologies so that they benefit most of us and we don't wreck the environment in the process. So this is the first take-home message. Think about technologies not just as being physical technologies, but all the abstract ideas that are just as important for us to be able to collaborate and live in this world. And when something new comes about, then it's always a good idea to give it a name. I would like for you guys to think about, at least when I talk here, maybe when you go home, that we can call these new technologies for the big technologies. I love this name. And I didn't invent it myself, but it talks about, or it sort of addresses that these new technologies, at the core of them, you have biotechnologies, you have information technologies, you have nanotechnologies, and you have cognitive technologies, or cognitive technologies. But it's not only them, it's a big ecology of technologies, and there are literally hundreds of them. And we all know the internet. We've heard a little bit about AI here today and machine learning, robotics, automation, yada, yada, yada. But just when I talk about the new technologies, I call them the big technologies because really at the end of the day, it is a convergence between some of these technologies that's making a huge difference, at least from my perspective, having developed some of these new technologies. So, these new technologies, they have two features that are really critical, that are very different from any technologies we've ever touched or created as humans. They are becoming more and more lifelike, and they are becoming more and more intelligent. So I've tried to somehow make a map of increasingly more lifelike systems and increasingly more intelligent systems. And then we have put humans here up in the corner. And I just want to mention, when I was a young man and a scientist, it was sort of in the dark ages of AI. So we, of course, I didn't want to work in this area. I wanted to go up here and try to understand what life is. Turns out that was bad it would have been much better if I would have been riding this wave that has been building very rapidly in the last few years. But it is true that it's interesting to see the history in that. So my scientific career has been to try to create life from scratch, try to put chemicals together, try to understand the physical chemical conditions in such a way so that you can actually go from non-living materials to living materials in the laboratory. It's a little bit like the old alchemist where they tried to make gold, except that we believe that it is indeed possible, and some of the different teams that are working in this direction are very close to actually being able to create life from scratch. Now, another thing I want to emphasize is that many of these artificial intelligence systems, they've begun to surpass human intelligence in very special areas. But we don't have any general intelligence that is similar to human intelligence. But let's just try to crawl up this axis a little bit, because that's an area that I know quite well. And some 15 years ago, we designed a protocell, we designed a living system that we have set out to create. And it is composed of a metabolism. You have resources and light coming in from the left, energy. And this metabolism can produce the container components and the information components. The container keeps the metabolism and the information together, and the information catalyzes the production of the building blocks in very simple ways. And we're standing on top of the giants. We have on the one hand Manfred, who said that for us to bootstrap from non-living to living materials, we need to have coupled autocatalytic components. Ilya Prigozhin, he was emphasizing that only systems that are driven by free energy can actually move away and become self-organizing. And for Neumann, he said that, we don't really need to make systems out of the same materials if we are interested in similar functionalities. We know that computers are built quite differently from humans, and still they can do sophisticated things. And as a matter of fact, none of the molecules we're using to implement such a system are the same as they are in modern life. This is a bit of a busy slide, but I just wanted to mention that what we are doing is making a very simple system and think about it as an oil droplet in water that's coated with soap, and that's a body, that's a container. We then, on top of this container, on the exterior of this container, we put a metabolic molecule and we put an informational molecule. So these are the guys that are sitting on the exterior, and then we feed the system so it grows, and then the metabolism will digest some of the oil, and it will turn it into surface, so the system will divide. These droplets will be, they'll be too big, so they will simply divide. This is just free energy that determines that. And then we need to have the informational system to replicate too, and then we end up with two droplets of the same size. So it's much simpler than modern life. If you think about a modern cell, this is much simpler, but nevertheless, this is something that is doable in the lab. Well, I would say that now we've worked about 15 years, spent about $17 million. I was, the first many years I worked at Los Alamos National Lab, where we were developing some of these things. Later I moved back to Denmark. And these are some of the main milestones we have reached along the way. And we are now out fundraising again to get to this point where we will make this transition from non-living to living materials. So we have a system that can take in resources, convert them into building blocks, grow and divide, and undergo evolution. And this is, of course, this is building on or using molecules that are different from molecules in modern life. And I think that, this by itself is not it's not going to revolutionize the market in any way, in any time soon. But nevertheless, if you can make, or when humans can make living materials that are based on different principles than modern biology, that is definitely going to have a profound impact on technology. And this is all part of the BINC revolution. Another example, actually, I have here. You can. One of them, unfortunately, got a little bit damaged on the way over here. These are microchips that you can solvate them in water. These are dummies here. So, if you look at them up against the light, you can see them. They're about 100 microns on each side, and they're designed so that they have an onboard supercapacitor. They have some energy. They can move. They use a electroosmotic drive. They can catalyze chemical reactions. They have sensors, and then you can program them. They have a little what's it called, finite state machine, and then they're able to follow, for instance, gradients. If they can follow gradients and if they create a little bit of a chemical trail, then they can flock, just like ants. All of this is not working in the lab, I should say. It's a European Commission-sponsored project that was led by John McCaskill. But fortunately, it was not my lab that was supposed to build these things up to all the specs. We were doing the simulations, but I still think this is a really remarkable thing that you, when you make flux, when you make flocking behaviors by these tiny micro chips, you will then be able to mimic living systems in a new way, where you have, this is about an 8 millimeter by 8 millimeter thin film where you have these things. This is simulation. This is not real. This is not the real lab results. You can then have these guys undergoing replication, because you can actually have, you can control, by controlling what they are producing of chemicals and what they individually like, you can then make these two swarms divide, so that you have two swarms, or if you, depending on how your division is defined, you'll have multiple swarms, and you can then see here a succession of swarm divisions. And what you have to add here is not only chemicals, but you also have an energy from the supercapacitors. You have to add new chips. So you have to throw in chips from your Chinese, what's it called, stock, as we talk about. So anyway, so this becomes part of the resources. But it's just to give an idea of how living systems, we are pushing the envelope by mixing what it means, where we're exploring what living systems are, by mixing not only biochemicals, but also other technology from other areas. This is something I also want to mention. This is another part of synthetic biology, which this is not my work, but I want to emphasize is that with, for instance, these new CRISPR technologies, we can modify human or mammalian genetics, including our genetics here. And if you are a farmer, like my dad was, you could actually, today, you can buy cows without horns. These are cows that are permanently modified, so you've simply changed the gemline. We could do that with humans today, too. We're not allowed to do that, so we have signed treaties, all of us, all the different countries, but nevertheless, it's just around the corner where we'll be able to not only fix diseases, many inheritable diseases, which is wonderful, but also modify our own hardware. And I know science fiction writers have talked about this for a long time, but this time is coming very close. So think about it. Would you like to have more beautiful babies? Would you like to have more intelligent babies? We don't know how to do that yet, but it won't take long. And sometimes I wish my parents could have done that, but nevertheless, this is something that is maybe not being thought a lot about, but it is part of this big revolution. Here's another thing. I wasn't quite sure where I should put this slide in, but I think this is a very important conversation we also have to have, namely about the internet and privacy and cybersecurity. With a very simple device that many of you probably know, a Raspberry Pi. It doesn't need to be a Raspberry Pi, but a small computer and a flash drive, and this is about $100 worth of hardware, and a new software architecture. You'll be able to disrupt cloud storage, the cloud solution, because you can take the cloud home, and you can, by making sure that you encrypt all your data, and you share them across villages, then you never need to use the cloud because you have it all at home. You will have faster response times for your pictures or your text and whatnot, and you will have than you have with the giant data centers. You can, depending on how big the villages are, how much redundancy you define, you can then have you can then easily have data times that are comparable to lifetimes comparable to the age of the Earth, so which is probably not necessary. And you can another very important thing is that by using these small guys, it's about 3 watts when it's going full power. You will have a much less of an environmental impact by using this decentralized solution than the cloud, because the fastest polluters of CO2 in the world are the data centers. It's a use of our internet. It overtook our global traffic, what's it called, airline traffic control here already in 2013. And by implementing this at home or in your business, you will be completely secure. You'll have complete privacy, and you can do all your telecommunication. You can, of course, on such networks, define your cryptocurrency, et cetera, et cetera. But it's just to say that these technologies, with very little resources, we can, with these technologies, build solutions that are fundamentally different from the solutions we see today. Here's another example that I'm personally very excited about. We know how to do industry when we are having a top-down design. We don't know how to do industry like we have in biology down at the nanoscale. But for Neumann, he showed back in the 50s that mathematical machines that can make everything, including copies of themselves, they do exist. Von Neumann was also the guy who showed us how to make a universal computer, this one, your cell phone. This is a von Neumann architecture. This universal constructor has not received as much attention as the first one, but it's becoming a very important vision for many of us to try to build machines that can make everything, including copies of themselves. And the European Commission has been visionary in their Future Emerging Technology program to sponsor many projects to start exploring how this can be done. But you can imagine a machine, this was almost impossible to imagine for many people before you knew about 3D printers. Today you'll say, oh yeah, I can see that. But it is not inconceivable at all to have such machines at home or in your business in half a generation from now. Just think about how fast the PC revolution or the cell phone revolution has been unfolding. And of course, everybody would want to have a machine that can make almost everything at home. And this, depending on how you implement these things, you will have very different kinds of societies. You could have the big companies own all the IP and they control it, or you can have yourself owning all the IP and controlling it. So you could use that to democratize material production in the same way as the internet, in principle, makes it possible for us to to democratize access to information and distribution of information. So, external human AI enhancement, I'm sure you all are very well aware of that. We all use Google Maps and etc. other maps to find our way. We did that to find our way here. Some of you know what this is. It's to find your love, right? This is Tinder. And what is this? Do you know what that symbol? That's Watson, yeah. So you know, for many of us, this is maybe the only way we can find a mate, and certainly we know that, or find our way, and also Watson is significantly better than any single doctor today in terms of diagnostics. So we are increasingly finding ways to have AI, external AI, augmented AI to help us. And I think that Harari, he said it very well yeah, we can go through all the arguments, but in practice today, I think most of us who are working in this area, we view living systems as biological algorithms, or they can, at least a big part of what we are doing can be used at very complicated biological algorithms we don't understand yet. We have been developed through evolution, and that means that we at the end of the day probably are these kinds of algorithms. Now, just for you guys to remember it, I mean, I think this is again Harari that I think is really wonderful here. He says that who should I marry? And in the old days, before the Renaissance, you should go to the scriptures. You should ask your priest or the religious leader. And then with all this liberal stuff, you had to, ask yourself. Inside, you have this little person or thingy that tells you what's right and wrong. And this is penetrating not only who should you marry today, but also what is right and wrong. You have when you have trials, you have people sitting in and sort of voting on whether the guy has committed murder or not, right? But it won't take long before you can ask the cloud or our rain system who you should marry, because even though we're all unique snowflakes, we're not completely unique. Actually, there are thousands of people that are similar to us, and by sort of leaning up against what is already known, you could maybe figure out that you should maybe pick Anna instead of Sophia, even though Anna is more interesting or whatnot. So just to wrap up this part here, so the way I see it is that, but there are many reasons why we should really engage with this conversation now. All these different technologies, they are being coupled to the Internet of Things. Today, pretty much all communication happens via the Internet. We have all data storage, most financial transactions, digital manufacturing, transportation will increasingly happen here, both with pathfinding, but also with automated cars. Energy is controlled there, and as we get transition to a more sustainable energy system, we'll have decentralized production of energy. All our health data is there. If I have to interact with my government or my local government, I have to use the Internet. I can't talk to people anymore. All living things, we're sending descriptions of or designs for genes and for cells, etc., on the Internet. And by having all these infrastructures that earlier were separately, all coming together in the Internet of Things, that means that this Internet of Things touches pretty much every aspect of your life. So that means that how we govern this Internet of Things is going to determine, 95% of what is possible, how your life can unfold. How many governments are discussing the governance of this? Because this is what we have to think about. How do we want to have such an Internet of Things? So what should the governance be? And I personally believe that we should have transparency, and there has to be some kind of democratic oversight. And that should pop up to the top of the priorities in the very near future. because this is again a place where our technologies, they're going in all kinds of different directions, and we haven't figured out yet how to deal with it. I'm sure you've seen pictures like this before. This is a sort of a skill axis, whatever that means, how smart we are, how good we are at solving problems. And this is a number of people. There's some people out here who are not so good at so many things, and then there's some people out here that are really good at many things, and the most of us are in the middle, right? Now the problem is, the real challenge is that the industrial automation left room for all of us. There's still room for all of us to do stuff. Whereas if you look at the giants here today, they are hiring very skilled people, and they make automation of human skills that make a big part of us obsolete. And what we do with that can't be solved with technology. We have to somehow figure out, not with physical technology, we have to figure out how to make these new social technologies to deal with this new situation. So now I'm doing something that I haven't presented before. Well, it's not so scary, this one, because these are not my data. This is from Roser and his team from Oxford here. They are looking at the GDP per capita, and since it's from England, we took these data here, all the way from 1270. It's wonderful data. It's not mine. And you can see here, this is a wealth, the average wealth for GDP from a person in England, about 2070, and then the Black Death came and decimated the British population, so it cut it almost into half. So everybody got wealthier because the people who survived, they got the stuff, the chairs and the farms and whatnot. But then you have, these are the dark Middle Ages. At that time, nothing happened because the church took good care of all the knowledge and made sure the only thing you could read was the Bible, right? And then the Brits, they went out to the colonies and they brought wealth and whatnot. And at some point, something crazy started to happen. And you have to note that this is logarithmic scale. And the Industrial Revolution took off, and it started in Britain, and the wealth skyrocketed. The same pattern is true, or can be seen clearly. This is from the Swedish data. So the Industrial Revolution came later to Scandinavia. We were always a little bit slower, except when we were Vikings. Remember that, right? But you can still see there is clearly a difference between these two eras. So this is where we are all farmers, and this is where we are entering the industrial era. And now let's have a look at the structure in this. So what I'm doing now is looking at the structure in this rapidly growing part of our economy, the recent from the 1800s and until today. So first of all, we have to remove trend. If you want to see whether there is a pattern, we have to remove the trend. So we take the raw data, we took the logarithm, we saw that here. So we took the logarithm, there's already taken the logarithm, but you can see it's still growing. If you then just take a linear trend take a trend out, that's not enough. You actually have to take a parabola away to get a stationary time series. And then you can see on the upper picture, we have the GDP per capita for 30 Western countries, which is the red one, and the blue one, and the red one is for Denmark. It turns out that since I've been studying the Danish series several times in my scientific career, so I know these data quite well, know the history quite well. So we could use the Danish data instead of doing the ones on the all the European data. And I should say that there are some differences, but all of them, they look the same. You can see that if you look at the trends, the growth trend, all countries in the world have had a long decline in terms of the growth. This is away from the trend, the exponential trend, right? So they're all diving down except of there is India and Sri Lanka, Argentina and Chile, Indonesia and South Africa. They have a little bit different pattern. We're only able to find data from 40 countries, and there are some interesting small differences in the wave pattern. In this wave pattern, if you look at the U.S. and the rest of the world, and the UK is somewhat in the middle. And these are details we can talk about later if you want. Now, what we've done, early on in my life, I've been fascinated with this long-term economic development. So if we take the data and we continue to assume we have an industrial economy, and we use Mensch's ideas about how growth comes in by, we have these big discoveries, some of them, there will come innovations that will then be implemented into the capital, into the real economy. And as the real economy is really roaring and things are moving, then you will not have innovations come and take from the big discoveries. You have to wait until the niche is somehow filled out. Then this is for the Danish data, and these are from the mathematical model. And then we've tried to run it out. We've made gazillions of what's it called, Monte Carlo simulations, and we get something that looks more or less like that. This is what the model thinks if we say we continue with the industrial economics. This is for the English data, and we can actually use the same, and it was pretty much the same what's it called, technology that was used through the Middle Ages, and then we could implement this Mensch's theory here, and then it will. This is for Britain, and this is not around the trend. You will then have a leveling out. So I guess my question is, and you have you can see the Fourier spectrum here, and we've done lots of other data. So I think this is the real question we all have to ask ourselves. Is this big transition, this transition that's driven by the physical technologies taking off, is that just another technological revolution within the industrial societal framework? This is what Carl Schwab and the World Economic Forum, they say. Or is it a more fundamental transition that's akin to the transitions we've experienced before that, when we went from hunter-gatherers to agriculturally based society, when we went from agriculturally based society to an industrial-based society. And more of, I think, the scientific community is coming our way. I remember the first international meeting I organized was in 2015 at the Lawrence Center in the Netherlands. And now the Santa Fe Institute, we are starting a workshop series that's focusing on how we can actually grasp these complicated issues. And why, whether it's one or the other, is really important, because if we'll only have moderate changes if it's the first, and pretty much everything will change if it is the second. Just think about the transition from when we're all farmers till the industrial society. Every country wrote new constitutions. We changed, pretty much everything. Thank you very much.